And so what I'm presenting on today is titled The D&H Canal, 19th Century Engine of Prosperity, Hudson River edition. Since you folks are down the river a little bit, I thought I'd try and concentrate a little bit more about the connection to the Hudson River. After all, it's the Delaware and Hudson Canal. So it runs from it really runs, I don't know why they didn't include the Lackawaxen. Somebody asked me in my last presentation, but I think, you know, the Delaware and the Hudson were the two really important rivers in America. The North River, the Hudson, and the Delaware, the South River. And so I think that's probably where the name came from. But, you know, a canal that just gets you to Kingston, New York would be valuable, but really without the Hudson River, the canal system, the D&H Canal was to get product to New York City, as you'll see as I go on here. And so the Hudson River was an integral part. This canal would not have existed if it were not connecting to the Hudson River. And so, as I say, as much as I can, I'll include the Hudson in the story. And this story begins during the War of 1812.
Have to be
So,
on another call at 3 o'clock. But
How long does it last?
I don't know.
so that didn't sound like a question. So the War of 1812, we had an energy crisis. You know, people, we don't think about it, but America was settled beginning in the early 17th century. Certainly the Hudson Valley, but this continent was settled, well, it was settled by the indigenous people whose land it really was. But when European settlement comes in after Columbus, the Appalachian Mountains were a huge barrier. It was a big bunch of mountains to get over. And so everything east of the Appalachians was heavily settled and heavily clear-cut. We're now 200 years into settlement, and we needed wood, and we needed a fuel source, and we needed coal because we had not enough wood, if you will. But the War of 1812 interrupts our coal supply. You know, it was cheaper to ship coal across the Atlantic Ocean than by land in America in 1812. Sure, we had lots of coal down in Virginia. It wasn't called West Virginia yet, but we didn't have transportation infrastructure. It was too expensive. You just had Native American trails and waterways, and that was it. We didn't have the Roman roads like they had in England. So the War of 1812, things come to a head. We do not want to buy from the British. And it blows my mind that it was cheaper to ship the 4 to 6 weeks, was it maybe, across the Atlantic Ocean than by land in America. But that was the fact. But the other thing about the War of 1812 is that a pair of dry goods merchants by the name of Morris and William Wirtz, I know it says Maurice, but it was pronounced, we're told, Morris. So there's Morris, William, and brother John. There was also Charles, but these were the three more important. Morris and William were a family of Quakers, and this informs the story to some degree, and they were dry goods merchants. And during the War of 1812, they got a contract from the U.S. government to supply uniforms for the war effort. The United States government was kind of land rich and cash poor. Some things never change. And so as a result, the brothers were paid not in money, but in coal-bearing lands in the Wyoming and Lackawanna valleys of Pennsylvania. And here we've got a very early map. This is a fertile area. There's the Lackawanna River, which comes into this story, in the Susquehanna. But all this section, tons and tons of anthracite coal, not the soft bituminous coal that was in Virginia and that we were buying from England, but what ends up ultimately being a better product once you can convince people you can burn it. So they get this land and they start marketing their coal. And here's a map, I think this is an 1831 map of Pennsylvania. And so the brothers started a little town. It was somewhere around in here. It's not on this map. There were maps with more detail, but then would have just been too confusing. And you can see there in Philadelphia, they're trying to service that market. Well, you've got the Schuylkill River, you've got the Lehigh, all these coal fields. And do you notice something? They're all closer to Philadelphia. So the brothers, they get they load up some coal onto a raft. So the way you ship stuff at this point in time was that you had a one-way, you either took a raft of logs, because logs were a product, you know, I say that we needed the coal, but they still did have timber, just not enough for our energy needs. You would load up, you would either load up a raft of logs, or you might even build a boat called an ark. be about 75 foot long, 10 or 15 foot wide. You would then load it up with your coal, and then you run it down the river. In the case of the brothers, they got it over to the Lackawanna River, ran it to the Delaware River, and then down the Delaware River into Philadelphia. Well, one of their very first raft loads of coal founders within a mile. And they managed to sell it, which always blows my mind, you know, because you're in this section that's not really heavily developed because people haven't yet started to really exploit the natural resources that are there, mainly this anthracite coal. So, but you got to imagine you're not going to be that lucky that often, you know. And by the way, what they would do is generally ship in the spring when you had a lot of water during freshets, so as to make it hopefully easier to get to market. Once you got the coal to market, you had to sell it. Now, this is anthracite coal. Blacksmiths in the Philadelphia area during the Revolution, Jesse Fell had a foundry making nails using anthracite coal. The blacksmiths loved this stuff. Well, in 18th century America, if you were a blacksmith, you would have to use a hardwood fire otherwise, and you'd start that hardwood fire, but about halfway through the day, it would not be useful. You'd have to stop everything and refire. With anthracite, once you learned how to burn it, you could get a fire going all day, and they worked a lot longer than we work today. But it also, it actually carbonized the product. So it also made something more akin to steel, because basically steel is carbonized iron. So blacksmiths loved it, but the general public, they were, you know, leery. By the way, the trick to burning anthracite coal was to get a lot of oxygen to start a really good hardwood fire, and then have a grate where you can get lots of air around it. It just needs more oxygen. You're going to burn more fuel, you need more oxygen to oxidize it. And in fact, the D&H company builds special grates and markets them to get people to buy this coal. And there's stories of people buying the coal and in frustration, just using it to line the streets. Beautiful, shiny black rocks. That probably looks really nice. But, you know, meanwhile, the native people knew you could burn it, the blacksmiths. They first discovered it where river valleys it would cut through and you'd see these stones, and somehow the native people knew that it would burn. But the American public had to be educated. So the brothers get some of their coal to Philadelphia, but they're not competitive. So they have to think of another market. Well, this is now, the Erie Canal starts in 1817 and opens completely, I won't get the, 1823, I believe. I don't think it's 25. At any rate, in that 6-year period, the Erie Canal, and by the way, the Erie Canal exploited the Mohawk River Valley, which is the first place where nature gives you a chance to get through the Appalachians. So the Erie Canal, 365 miles, it only needed 85 locks. The D&H had much rougher terrain to go over. But the success of the Erie Canal changes everything in America, because in this very short period, really the first half, maybe first 3/4 of the 19th century, America has canal fever. Well, it's the most efficacious way to build transportation infrastructure. So no more of this sending your raft down to the market, selling the product and selling the raft. You can go both directions. You can now start to, you know, the Hudson River, by the way, was one exception. The Hudson River being a tidal estuary, you can in fact travel in both directions. In fact, if you're paddling, it's best to go with the tide. But most waterways were a problem, and this is why canals, the Erie Canal proves that canals are a way to work. Famously, DeWitt Clinton over here on the right, this is a wonderful, Asher B. Durand, the Hudson River School of Painters, started out as an engraver, and this is an engraving from an 1830 or 40 biography of DeWitt Clinton in my collection. It'll wind up at the Canal Society someday. Really well executed, wonderful. He's the father of the Erie Canal. When he was governor, maybe he wasn't even governor yet. When Jefferson was president, he must have been governor. He approaches him, because he was governor at 2 different periods. He approaches Jefferson to try and get the federal government to finance what becomes the Erie Canal. Jefferson, scientist, great technology guy. At first, he loves the idea. He just thinks it's marvelous. But then he walks away and he says, it's going to be 100 years before we'll have the technological know-how. Just another, and I love Thomas Jefferson, but just another case of cognitive dissonance in a great early American, you know. Says all men are equal, but has slaves his entire life. Is for small government, but makes the Louisiana Purchase. And here's another one. The Erie Canal, we'll never be able to do that. But in fact, the Erie Canal becomes the training ground for American engineers. So there were no schools of civil engineering. Let me get my pointer out of the way. No schools of civil engineering in America at this time. There's West Point, which opened under Jefferson, but they're really concerned with civil engineering for the military, not civilian projects, if you will. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute doesn't open up until I think it's 1823, 24, Union College about the same time. In fact, the very first civil engineering degree given by an American university was given at Union College in Schenectady in 1843. Well, this is deep into the canal era at this point. So the Erie Canal became a training ground. That means some of the people involved with it went to England and studied canals, which is to say they'd travel along and ask questions and look at how they did it. But these are three men that become important to the D&H story. We've got Judge Benjamin Wright here in the center. He was the chief engineer of the Erie Canal. And these two gentlemen flanking him, here's John Jervis and James McEntee. John Jervis, 19-year-old Rome, New York farm boy. At the age of 19, he gets a job working alongside Judge Wright as they're laying out and building the line of the canal, as did James McEntee, another Western New York man. You know, the history of the Erie, everybody thinks, you know, the Irish built all these canals. My canal, definitely. The Irish didn't dig the original Erie. There were too many people in the unsettled western end of the state that needed work. It was largely dug originally. Now, in the expansions, they used the Irish labor, but not initially. So James McEntee and John Jervis trained under Benjamin Wright and learned civil engineering. It basically, in fact, Benjamin Wright is referred to as the father of civil engineering in America. The D&H company, so the brothers, they've decided they try and exploit the fields a little bit. They get some coal in, but they realize quickly that Philadelphia, they're not going to be able to compete. And this is true from the very beginning. This company is so innovative. You know, they have to figure out how to do these things. People credit railroads with developing the modern corporation, but I'm here to tell you the canal companies informed those railroads. The canal companies really started to create the modern American corporation. How do you run a business across such a wide area? And so what we're looking at right here, Benjamin Wright is hired in 1823, I think it is late 23, to figure out a route for this canal. William Wirtz had hunted up in this direction, so he knew the lay of the land, and so they knew that it was a possible thing to do. Judge Wright, they hire him. Well, he's already so sought after. If you're digging a ditch in America in the 1820s, Judge Wright is your man. So he's working on a lot of projects. He's so busy, the survey is done by John Sullivan and John Mills. And he lays out this route, and this map is then produced. And there's some details about this map. I won't get us down in the weeds. It's a fascinating map. I found this on an online auction. I've seen it in books. We have an original of it now that will be on display in our new museum. But this was a document for them to raise money. As I say, he lays out this canal route, says these are the river valleys you're going to be in, and gives them an estimate, 1.2 million. That's $30 million in today's buying power. A lot of money, right? So they form a corporation, largely New York City people. So these Pennsylvania guys who get the right from the Pennsylvania legislature to dig a canal, they basically get taken over by New Yorkers. Makes sense because their ideas, Philadelphia's got plenty of coal, but New York really could use it. And this is a point in time, Philadelphia in the War of 1812 is the largest city in America. By 1820 now, New York City is partially because of the Erie, but also because of geography in general, because of the Hudson River, because of the access to the Atlantic coast. New York was destined by geology and geography to become the center that it is today. So the brothers had a great idea, and they had a plan, and they had a dollar amount, and so they go to raise money. The Tontine Coffee House on Wall Street. Coffee houses in early American history, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, were places where men of means, people with money, would meet with people with business opportunities and find places to invest their money. It's no accident that the financial services industry in New York City are centered on Wall Street. It started with the Tontine. The New York Stock Exchange was started as a Tontine, which is well, again, I won't get into the weeds, but it started as this organization of people trying to buy and sell stocks. In the late 18th century, but its actual first board meeting was in 1823 in the stockroom, the boardroom of the Tontine Coffee House. But on a cold January day, January 7th in 1825, the D&H Canal Company opens their stock books. And the lore says that it was a cold January day, but they had such a hot fire burning that they're opening windows and shedding garments, and they oversell their initial stock offering in a single day. By mid-afternoon, everybody's all right. This is it. They also sold stock at banks in Kingston and Goshen. Kingston, the non-river terminus, basically, of the canal. Goshen, I don't even know why Goshen. It's not on the canal. It's the wrong side of the Shoalgums, I think, certainly. But at any rate, it must have been a big enough commercial center. They take 5% on the stock, so they start with $75,000. They wind up being a very successful stock. In the Civil War years, they pay 30% on their stock. Not bad. And one of the other interesting things, and this was something that happened a lot in early American history, we didn't have American currency in any real way. I've seen pennies and stuff, but it wasn't a formalized thing. Anybody could run, not anybody, but you had to get permission, but you could run a bank. And the D&H Canal Company and a lot of other early industries, especially canal companies, got permission to run banks because it was a way for them to make money for their stockholders while largely expending their money to build this canal. And that's indeed what they did. They can take $500,000 and use it for banking for 20 years. And there is a $3 bill for the D&H Canal, signed by John Wirtz, and I think it's Williams. John Wirtz, the second president, one of the Wirtz brothers, their first successful president. And Williams was, I think, their second or third treasurer. So now they got money in hand. Now you got to get people to dig it. Do you know, even in 1825, there were jobs, not Native Americans, because the Native Americans, of course, are the indigenous, what we call Indians. But the European settlers, there are already jobs they didn't want to do, and canal building was one of them. But I love this quote. Irishmen, for who else would dig and delve and drudge and do, oops, I can't see that, and make canals and roads and execute great lines of internal improvement. Irishmen. Charles Dickens in a book he wrote after touring America. And indeed, this canal could not have been built without the Irish. I've done a lot of research on the marginalized populations on the D&H, and that informs this talk. I have absolutely no proof that people of color dug this canal. I have to believe they did. We're at an era now when the slaves are largely freed. That's, again, another thing we can get into the weeds about slavery in New York. I'm inclined to think that there probably was also people of color who, because it was marginalized people who would work for 50 cents a day who did this work. But I have in all my extensive research, no proof. I can prove that they worked on it from the very beginning, but I can't prove that they helped dig it. But and I wonder too whether, because there was these just young Irish men in these little camps, it may have been that the Irish wanted it for the Irish. In fact, the Irish would fight amongst themselves. If you weren't from the same town, they'd fight because they wanted to make sure their homeboys, we call them today, got the work. But at any rate, money in hand, they build a 108-mile long canal with 110 locks to begin with. It goes down to 108 later. I won't bore you with that. And it goes from the Lackawanna River, that's not correct, Lackawanna River to the Delaware River, following. So if you're going to dig a canal, you put it in river valleys for two reasons. One is that you need a source of water. So whenever the level of the canal got down below where the river was, they'd have dams and little feeders. The other thing is, think about it, in a river valley, if you're trying to have as few locks as possible. Locks are devices to move boats over changes in elevation. You want to have as few locks as possible. They cost you in manpower, they cost you in water, they cost you in time. And remember, I said the Erie had 365 miles and 85 locks. Here's 108 miles, and they needed 110 locks to begin with. So they followed the Lackawaxen River to the now I'm confused, to the Delaware River. Here they're following the Neversink. Along here we get into the Sandberg Creek. Here in Ellenville, we're into the Roundout Valley. It follows the Roundout Creek all the way into the Hudson up here. They're still 80 miles from their intended market of New York City. But you know, the Shoalgum Mountains all along this line here were like the Appalachians, an impediment. They actually, the Tom Fathers of Kingston, somewhere over here, actually petitioned the company to have them terminate the canal there, but the Shawangunk Mountains were too big and they even actually sent John Jervis to do a survey of it. But the trying to get over the Shawangunk Mountains was too much. They don't actually get tunneled until 1871 or 2, one of the railroads finally tunnels through. They built a 108-mile long canal, 32 foot wide on the top, 20 on the bottom, 4 foot deep, 110 locks, 22 aqueducts, over 200 bridges. And they do it on time and not quite on budget, but much more than we would today. And they build through mainly wilderness. And in some instances, here's a scene in Rosendale where they had to work around the buildings. But whole towns sprung up. This is largely wilderness. Rosendale would be an exception. Most of these towns grew up because the canal was there. But it's an immense undertaking. The bridges were like this. Believe it or not, this is a covered bridge. This is a wonderful E.L. Henry painting of the D&H Canal in Ellenville, New York. But these bridges here, when another fellow historian told me, "Oh, Bill, you've got covered bridges," I said, "No, we don't, because the walkway isn't covered." Well, it winds up, when you were building a covered bridge in early 19th century, they discovered that a wooden truss bridge would only last maybe 15 years. If you covered the trusses, they last 50 to 60 years. So these bridges, what you're seeing there, you look at that wood, that's just to cover the trusses. This is what we call a pony truss covered bridge. I've identified, I think it's 26 covered bridges, some of them completely unknown to the Society for the Preservation of the Covered Bridge. I'm about to contact them and give them some of my research. And Ron Knapp and I, the other historian, he's got 2 books on covered bridges already. We're going to write an article about the D&H bridges. A fascinating story. But they probably had over 200 of them. Probably most of their bridges were bridges like that in the early period. And these 108 locks were composite locks. They were built of dry laid stone lined with white oak. And this is a wonderful picture of Lock 31 in Ellenville, no longer extant, this particular lock. Lock 30, all the locks numbered down, most of them, the 4, 27, 28, 29, they're all extant. This lock is completely gone. What was in the center of town. Since we were talking about covered bridges, a little side note, it ties into what I spoke about earlier. What we have there now, and I've got pictures of some items where they, some locations like the Canal House, where I've got pictures with the pony truss covered bridge, and then I've got a picture with this later. I call this a Squire Whipple bridge. Squire Whipple was one of the first engineers to graduate from the Union College Civil Engineering course, and he designed these bridges for the Erie, but they made their way across New York State's canals. It's a great design, so it makes sense. So an amazing undertaking that they actually have it fully watered from round out to Port Jervis. By the end of 1827, they even build a toll road to connect with another toll road and get their coal to there. And they get coal to Tidewater, as they would say, in 1827. And they're training people how to, because nobody knew how to operate locks, and how to operate a canal. They're learning how to do it. The D&H Canal Company, though, Honesdale was the Forks of Dyeberry, but like so many towns along the route, they got named for luminaries. Well, Philip Hone was their first president. He steps down after a year when he gets elected mayor of New York City. He sees it as a conflict of interest. They had about 900 foot of the Moosuc Mountains they had to go over. And so they developed a gravity railroad, a 17-mile long railroad. And it's called the gravity because it used the weight of the laden cars going down to pull the light cars up. So they were all connected. There were 4 or 5 gravity railroads, mostly in Pennsylvania. These are another sort of interesting early American, and most of them are no longer there because their lines were only to get over these mountains that now we found better ways around and over. But the gravity railroad was in and of itself a technological wonder. You can see here they eventually extended. It started in Carbondale, but they eventually buy coal over in here and they extend it through all these towns here. In 1850 or the 1840s, the Pennsylvania Coal Company, that's a whole nother side story, but all of the officers of the Pennsylvania Coal Company were on the D&H board first. I think they were trying to create a friendly rival. In the end, they go to court. The D&H wins but never collects, and historians are the only beneficiaries. I'm studying the 5,000 pages of testimony, and it's a wonderful source of primary, and it's helping correct secondary sources. It's great. The internet makes so many things much easier to parse and to learn about. So this is a map of some of the, where the, getting you to Rosendale, if you will. I'm pointing at my screen like you can see me there. Huh? And here's a great picture, gives you a sense of the lay of the land. Notice there's not a lot of trees. You know, that's why they needed this coal. And the D&H company, a company of firsts. They're the first $1 million private enterprise in American history. Did I not mention that? I meant to. When they raised that $1 million in one day, nobody had done that. Nobody had even capitalized a project that large at that point. But they also ran the first steam locomotive on U.S. soil, on the Western Hemisphere, in fact, the Starbridge Lion. Unfortunately, John Jervis had spec'd out the tracks to take 5 tons, and this thing came in at 7 tons. My personal feeling is that it was a disconnect between measurements. I've done a little research, and from what I can see, the imperial ton in England, so I like to say to people when I'm doing tours, it's my contention the Starbridge Lion was 5 tons in Starbridge, but it was 7 tons in Rosendale. And it's because they had a different unit of measurement. Unless you say that that seems unlikely, a similar thing happened with a Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope, somebody built something on it to inches instead of metric or vice versa. They didn't discover it till the darn thing was in the air and in space, and they had to send up an entire shuttle mission just to fix that. So I'm pretty sure that the Starbridge Lion came in. It was not the British trying to get even with this or anything. I mean, they're trying to sell this technology. They were at the forefront. These are the earliest locomotives. It was simply nobody thought about the fact that a ton isn't a ton the world over, you know. And as I say, I've done a little research because the size of these things have changed. But by my math, the imperial ton of 1829 was 5 to a freaking ton of 7. They ordered 4 of these. These were $4,000 a piece. The America exploded on trials. Well, you know, steam technology had been around for 40, 50 years, but it's not until the 1850s that some genius invents what to you and I seems obvious, the pressure relief valve. These things were exploding promiscuously. The steamboat industry, they had things called safety barges, so that if something hit the fan on the boat that was pulling you, you were safe, and the barge behind it was just a barge with no motive power that had a nice bar and a chair you can hang out, but it was safer. It was a safety barge. It's not until somebody says, hey, you know, you can make a valve that'll let the steam out before it turns into shrapnel. The other 2 engines, I think, were never delivered, and it's one of those mysteries. There's a lot of different stories about what happened to them, but I have a feel. I live long enough. I'll get to the bottom of that one. There's some research I'll have to do, but so they opened the entire canal in October of 1829, and this is another picture of Ellenville, just a little bit forward of that Lock 31. Again, you can tell because that building is the Hutton Donaldson building there. And that's that Squire Whipple Bridge I pointed out in that other photograph. So now, who worked on the canal? So here's one of those things where I like to quote. John Johnston was a contemporary. He as a child lived in Pond Eddy on the Delaware River. The early surveyors actually camped out on his family's property. Hell, he and his friends played surveyor for weeks afterwards because they were watching the guys. But then when he's in the latter part in the 1890s, he starts writing his reminiscence, and they're really great because he doesn't pull any punches. You know what he felt about people. You know, you get to a certain age and you just don't care what people think, huh? But what he says about who worked on the canal: the mass were composed of the vulgar and debased, of ages from 10 to 60, of the various kinds, classes, and nationalities, Irish, Dutch, Africans, Americans, and others. All of the most lewd, vulgar, and depraved, and honesty compels the admission that the most objectionable features were found among the Americans. USA. And Dutch here probably refers to Germans. There's no indication. The Deutsch, think Pennsylvania Dutch. There were many German. One Sullivan County historian, John Conway, says it was Irish laborers and German stonemasons, and that sounds about right. I'm yet to find a primary in that quote, but if it exists, I'll dig it up at some point. So this is by the way, at this point in history, I like to point out this is an enterprise that could not have operated without. It could not have been built without the Irish. It could not have operated without the Irish, and we'll see that in another another newspaper account a little further on in this talk. And then I just like to show you some pictures of what it was like. By the way, all these pictures that we're going to see are going to be really probably post-Civil War period. Photography doesn't become even much of anything until the 1840s with the daguerreotype, but really think the Civil War, think Matthew Brady. Most of our, someday I'll figure out what my earliest photograph is. I've got one that says 1863. They're roughly, so all these pictures you're seeing are of the final enlargement and of the largest boats that they operated. The early boats were 9 foot wide, 75 foot long, and carried 30 tons of coal. As we'll see, they eventually get to something a bit larger. And also from the start, so here, D&H employee Lorenzo Sykes in his testimony in that court case I referenced, that even then they substitute women and girls for men and boys. We often find them the best boatmen. Well, the reason why they would be substituting them would be because they worked for less. And this young man is what we call a hoagie. And it's amazing in this testimony, boys would start working as young as 8 years old. They would work their way up to secondhand when they're in their teens or even just double digits. And there are numerous stories in this court case of, and I'm going to call them men at this point, 14 and 15 years old, solely in charge of a boat with 2 youngsters with them. This boat's carrying 130 tons of coal. And they're in the boats are $1,200, $800 to $1,400 in this mid-period. You grew up quick on the canal. Childhood is a 20th century invention. People had large families. Childhood mortality was high. This young man, grew up and was educated to some degree on the D&H Canal. But women were also very important. And here's another wonderful scene of E.L. Henry, maybe my favorite Canal Era painter. Someday I'll have to do a show. And I also just point out, not only were they operating a canal with 110 locks, all of which required at this point in time 2 tenders. The boats all required 3 people, but they also had miners, hundreds of miners. A huge enterprise. They were what's the phrase? I'm gonna forget. But a company that they mined the coal. They operated a railroad to get the coal to the canal that they built and operated to get to the store, all to get that coal to market. A vertically integrated corporation. And from the very first, they really wanted to take those boats right out onto the Hudson River. Makes sense, right? Apparently, those early 75-foot, 9-foot wide boats just couldn't navigate the tidal estuary. I've got a quote in an early history, unpublished history of the D&H, that's probably Benjamin Wright, talking about putting the boats on the canal, but I can say definitively that didn't happen. But here you can see, this is an 1869 painting, and there is an either D&H or Erie Canal boat on the wharf with these other, and that actually there's probably a canal boat from the looks of it too. But the D&H couldn't originally do that. And this is what they wanted to do. As it winds up, the Erie, I think there were probably more full river boats on the Erie Canal. Well into the 20th century, you would see tows of boats, up to 100 boats being pulled by steamboat along the Hudson River. And the D&H had really hoped to take advantage of that. Here's another, this is a picture of the famous Mary Powell, probably the most famous steamboat to ply the Hudson River, but I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in this in the foreground. Here's a tow of boats. It must have been interesting for the canalers in the latter period, families more than private enterprise. I wasn't sure if I had a question there. So you might have had a little bit of a busman's holiday. You tie up next to some friends. It's a day down to New York. Maybe you're taking a show, wife does a little shopping, But really the problem was that they didn't monetize it well enough. You didn't get paid as well for those 2 days as you could if you operated boats. So as a consequence, they hired James McEntee. James McEntee is a fascinating character. The McEntee family, well known in the Kingston, New York area. But James McEntee, he works for the canal company during construction, but then he operates boats on the Hudson for them. He operates boats on the canal. He builds the mansion house. But they hire him to build Island Dock. And Island Dock is this sandbar in the Roundel Creek that you can see they cut this nice, I'm going to say 40-foot wide swath through, and made this island. It was a whole little city. They were dropping pilings down 40 and 50 foot in 1845 when they're building this thing. Fascinating. And still extant today, although now it's all overgrown. I'm dying in this off season. I've got to get over there and see what there is to find on the ground. Part of why I'm so enthusiastic about this history is there's a lot of great stuff that you can learn today. I'm doing I'll do a plug at canalmuseum.org. We've got a D&H TV. We've got some 44 videos, including lectures like these, short 3-minuters. We've got tours of my old museum, and we've got what my favorite, Where is Our Historian, where I go out into the field and show you the D&H Canal as it exists today and talk about what's in the ground and what was there in the historic period. I just get a big kick out of it. It's why I'm so into this history, as I learned so much today walking on it, you know. A little side thing here, and I just discovered this. I'm on the board of the Century House, which tells the story of Rosendale cement. I'll get to that a little later too. And I found this, I don't know where it came from, but I've scanned it. It says round out, the coal shovelers moved in gangs of 3, worked in gangs of 3 men to a boat, and they shoveled onto the buckets, transferring cargoes from the canal boats. Probably broken time awaiting assignments, they acquired the occupational name of loafers. So if you've heard the term loafers, that's what they called these guys. They were loafers. Well, it's because they spent time waiting for the boats. But in busy times, up to 50 gangs, and here you see all these people. This is why the D&H Canal Company really wanted, in their final enlargement, they really wanted all the boats to go out on the Hudson River. That didn't happen either, and I'm working up to that now. One little more sidebar, since I like to talk about the marginalized. I have very few names. I know the names of, I think it's 4 black canalers total. I have the names of 5,000 people that worked on the canal. I only know 4 black, they're men in every instance. But here's Joe Jackson. We actually have his picture, Jim Jackson, excuse me. And in fact, I'm gonna reach out. His family still resides in Roundout, and I'd love to, but this is the only photograph that I've yet discovered of a black person working on the canal, and I know his name. I've got 2 or 3 pictures of black men, it's all men, but I don't know who they are. And that's typical, and why it's very hard to uncover these important histories. The D&H got so busy. This is a picture of the mouth of there's the Hudson River. Oh, well, don't do that. You're gonna go away in a minute, right? I'll see what, instead go back a slide. There's the Hudson River right there. And this is all, these are actually PA coal boats, probably by this point. Look at that. This is probably before the season started. That's all just boats in storage. It usually wouldn't have been this full in the full season. But they get so busy. Kingston Point on the Hudson River is later known because there was a Kingston Point Park. It's all overgrown and stuff. But the D&H Canal Company bought that in the 1850s and petitioned. This is from a map with them petitioning for the right to build. So here what we're looking at was facing from over here. We were looking this way. They got the right to park boats there. And this map was them petitioning for more space to put boats over here. I love maps. The D&H Canal, because of their gravity railroad, they had a little bit of problem. It was supposed to use chain, but iron and steel, well, it's iron making because steel making doesn't start until about the 1850s. Iron making was in its infancy. They had a lot of problems with the chains breaking. These cars had 4 tons of coal apiece. When the chain broke, it was dangerous. People died. So they went over to hemp rope, and in 1830, there's $4,000 put aside in their annual report for hemp rope on the gravity. And another interesting fact is because the D&H originators, the Wirtz brothers, were Quakers, the D&H Canal closed down on Sundays. They did not work on Sundays. They honored the Sabbath. The company also gave land to any denomination all along the route of the canal. So there's all these churches whose deeds were donated land from the D&H Canal Company. But on Sundays, because they were using hemp rope, crews would go out Saturday night, take down 17 miles of hemp rope, and put it back out Monday morning. Well, in the early 1840s, when the canal company is now finally getting successful and they're enlarging their canal by making it deeper in this period, John Roebling, he moves to Western PA to be a farmer, which he had no background in, a sheep farmer. And he wound up not being very good at it. Plus all the good land had been taken in the 18th century by the Germans that settled a lot of Pennsylvania. So he starts making wire rope. He had studied engineering in Germany and heard about the idea of making wire rope. And he had seen suspension bridges, not very successful, chain suspension bridges. But he starts making wire rope when he fails as a farmer. And some of his earliest buyers are gravity railroads. So he gets onto the D&H's radar because they buy his wire rope, and that works out just spectacularly. No more problems. They love the guy. And then when they go into their final enlargement in 1850, he builds 4 suspension aqueducts. And what you're seeing right here is the one that was right here at High Falls. We had a wonderful 2-arch Roman aqueduct, which was fine when they were deepening the canal. They went from 4 foot of water to 5 foot of water to 5.5 foot of water. They went from 30-ton burdens up to 80-ton burden. But because of the PA Coal Company, they're going to put more traffic on now. In 1850, they're going to go up to boats that are 91 foot long, 14.5 foot wide, and will carry eventually 130 tons of coal. So they could not use that aqueduct anymore. Plus, they rerouted here in High Falls, so the canal crossed at least 1 lock higher. I think it's a single lock higher than it did on that earlier route. So Roebling builds these 4 suspension aqueducts. Now there's only 1 left, and it's a national park service administers it, and you can walk or drive across it. It's a real big thrill. I'll be shooting a Where is Our Historian video there with my friend who's writing the book on John Roebling, probably in the next couple of weeks, and it'll probably get up on D&H TV sometime next year. So 1847, 1852, I give that as a broad, they opened for that larger traffic in 1850, but they don't really clear up all the points until 52. And 47 is when they started having Roebling build these suspension aqueducts. So now they're 15 foot wide, 92 foot long, and the canal is largely 40 to 50 foot wide. Actually, in some spots, it's only 32 foot wide, I can say definitively. But what they did is that it was also 32 foot wide on the bottom. They built stone walls, usually in towns, but not always. I know a spot north of Ellenville where the guy thought he had a lock in his property, but I knew he didn't. But we measured it, it was 32 foot wide, but the walls on either side were stone walls, perfectly perpendicular. Canal Company didn't care. It's interesting to see in the construction, you'll see different kinds of stone, you'll see different kinds of construction, you'll see different kinds of widening. Sometimes they move the berm, sometimes they move the towing path. They didn't care. They just wanted to get 2 boats past without causing trouble. And so here we are. This is one I can't read, but basically, again, it's foreigners. They say they employ 2,000 people. Actually, at some point, it was more like 5,000 people. By the 1850s, they had 1,000 boats with 3 people on the crew. Not always. People would cheat and run shorthanded. But again, this was foreigners, and now I can say definitively, black captains. So I know the story of a black captain who would supply an all-black crew for, I think it was $33, where the white captain wanted $40 a month. And so marginalized people got the work because they worked for less money. And the Canal Company, they were a capitalist enterprise from start to finish. It's why they embraced new technology. It's why they diversified. But here you can hear, these people just made their lives in the canal. And this is just interesting. This is from the PA Coal case. So, I was talked about the Canal Company wanting to get everybody out of the canal. Well, so here's the boats they were using prior to 1850. Eventually, this boat could carry 50 tons. Some could carry up to 80 tons. Sometimes they'd actually hip them. They'd put sides on and just get more coal on the top, a little top heavy. So here's a regular boat. Here's a section boat in 2 pieces. Well, these were built for the Morris Canal, which had an inclined plane. They had a point that they had to get up that was so high. Instead of a gravity railroad, the canal came to a spot where you brought your boat out onto a little railroad car, and then it went up the railroad car. Well, 90-foot boat, imagine the railroad car. So they started making section boats in 2 pieces, 45 and 45. Now, one of the secondary sources said that they separated the load and sent them out one way and the other. No, that wouldn't fly. He's absolutely dead wrong. And I know from other sources. But here's the thing. So in this same period, a boat like this that would just navigate the canal was $1,200. A full river boat, which had to be a foot and a half higher on the gunnels, was $1,400. Section boats were only $800. So the Canal Company wants everybody to buy a full river boat, but they can't force them. They're independent contractors buying their boats from the company, paying each load $10, $20 towards their boats. Section boats were prevalent because they were the cheapest boat. And it was one of the few times when capitalism sort of failed. Well, the general worker got a say in things. He could make more money with the cheaper boat where he didn't have to waste 2 days going down to New York City. There's another fun story, but again, in the interest of time, since I'm 50 minutes in now, I've got a million of them. You know, every time I do this talk, it's a little different. So if you enjoy this, there's another version of this talk that concentrates on the Erie up, and there's one that concentrates on the marginalized populations. And please go and enjoy. Once again, just the prosperity that the country that it went through. Once it's enlarged, this becomes, it's a coal company. They're selling coal. That's why but they're encouraging all these other industries. They're innovative. So here's one of those moments when I want to ask you, take a close look. I just discovered this picture in the archives of the Century House Historical Society. Never seen it before. I love when I see a D&H image I have not seen. I think this might be Philip Ford. I'll figure out where it was. 2 things to note. First, this is, because we're going to talk about the locks, that's one of the lock handles. You'll see in a drawing in the next slide. But take a close look here. Do you see that right there? That is a cutout of a bobby. A British policeman. For the life of it. So I ask you people while you're out there, anybody have any idea why this man would have a cutout of a bobby on his canal boat? I have no idea. I'm fascinated. There's a group of historical societies in the area called HAC, History Alliance in Kingston, and we're doing stuff together, and we're talking about ways to engage the public. I've got to put this out and get people's ideas on why is there a cutout of a bobby on this canal boat? The other interesting thing is that, boy, look at this guy. I know that this has got to be the 1890s because of the notation on the boat, but this guy is in early 20th century. He's a real fashion plate because he's dressed like I'd expect to see. You'll see a slide at the end of this show of the railroad, and they're all dressed like that. And it's probably the 1900s. But here we are. There's the mule driver. There are usually children. He might not really be the mule driver. He might just be. Actually, he's kind of too nicely dressed to be the mule driver. He may just be holding the team for the picture. But anybody have any idea? Any guesses on why there would be a bobby cut out on a boat? Me neither. But I'll keep working on it. I'll keep asking around, So the locks originally in that picture, so it did serve another circuit. You were seeing, it was on the downwater side. It was on this side of you were seeing one of these guys here. The miter gate, invented by Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century. Brilliant idea. So the miter gates, if you had 2 doors and you just put them flat, the water pressure would just blow them out. But if you make them like this, the water pressure holds them tight. It's like an arch, if you think about it, if you think like an engineer like I do. So you had these miter gates. You needed a person on either side to operate them. That's a lot. These guys are making about $30 a month in the mid-period. So, boy, if you could go down to a single lock tender, you're going to save 108 workers at 30 bucks, do the math. And this is so typical of this company. They convert to a single lock tender between 1853 and 1857. It's semi-patented. The section that this man is sitting on that operates these gates got a patent, and it was written by a C.W. Williams in Port Jervis. So this was for the D&H Canal. And as I was telling Luann earlier, I know from a letter of the engineers that one of the first locks they converted was here in High Falls. I would speculate that it was the lock right in front of the canal house, Lock 16, because the canal company bought that building in 1850. Now it's going to be my new museum next year. We purchased it with the help of Open Space Institute, New York State Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Just last week, we made the final payment to OSI. We own the building free and clear. Couldn't be happier. But the canal company, to get back to that story, I'm imagining that if they were trying out a new technology, you'd do it close to the office. So my speculation is that Lock 16 was one of the first locks to get. But they convert all of them. Probably the last money, this is 1857, this is probably one of the last big improvements they make in the canal, even though it operates until, well, in its entirety until 1898. Don't want to get to the end of the story yet. And here's another wonderful E.L. Henry. I love to mix up these black and white photographs with these period paintings to get you a little color. That and the postcards. I love postcards. Postcards are fascinating. They made postcards of the wackiest things. That's a whole presentation someday too. Someday I'll do just D&H postcards. That'll be fun. Just to give you an idea. But they embrace the telegraph. So the first telegraph lines are laid, what, 40, 44, 45, they run the line from DC to Baltimore. By 49, I can say definitively they were using the telegraph regularly. The engineer is saying just casually, please reply by telegraph. In other words, I need to know quickly. But they let them run a telegraph line along their entire 108-mile route, and then they used it. They're paying them. I see in the annual reports, I'm studying all these things. I'm writing a book and doing all my primary source research. They're paying $12,000 a year for telegraph lines. So they're letting the telegraph company run the lines on their right of way, but they're also telegraphing to their New York offices and eventually to their railroads, and they start to diversify. They start to move their product on things other than the canal. But just here's another, and this is right here in High Falls. This building, the telegraph house, is still extant. We're trying to get it. Long story. We're going to get it deeded to us at some point, and we'll save it and make it part of our 5 Locks Walk. It'll make our National Historic Landmark 5 Locks Walk a 6 Locks Walk if we pull this off, and I think we will. It may be the earliest telegraph house still extant. Telegraph office in America. So we're working on it, but we've got a lot of balls there. And I love this because they weren't successful in getting the canalers to take their boats on the Hudson River. They just start using new technology. They make the cover of Scientific American. And so here, this is interesting. Photography is prevalent now, but it's still very expensive in periodicals. So you get these steel engravings. And so here, instead of pictures, they make the cover. That's how important what they're doing is. This is 1890, June of 1890. We're fortunate we've got this wonderful period photograph, possibly taken by the same photographer that took that picture of Jim Jackson. I love this photograph. So here you got the unloader, the reloader, and here you can see that same thing. I love this sloop over here. And here you can see there's a heavy canal boat. There's one that's already been unloaded. But this is an image. A lot of these D&H images we've all got. This is an image that originated from my collections. I put it out on the internet, and I found it on another Facebook page. Now we're putting watermarks so people know where they came from. And I credited us because this is a unique image. It was taken probably by an employee of theirs by the name of Louis Hoysrat, who was an amateur photographer. We have 4 or 8 of his photographs and some of the original glass negatives. It's so exciting. And here's just another, look at that youngster walking with the mules. It was largely mules that they used. They worked longer and harder on less speed. They were more stubborn. But the saddest thing was that, a horse would go lame and then you'd have to pay somebody to watch them when you couldn't use them. Mules would just work until they dropped. Mules, mules, there's another fascinating story. George Washington and the King of Spain and mules in America. But I don't want to digress too much. You can tell I could do that, right? So the Gravity Railroad, by 1860, people start going, hey, you've got this railroad over the Moosic Mountains. They've got regular passenger service between Carbondale and Honesdale on their Gravity Railroad, making stops in between at Waymart, where they weighed the coal. And so this made it as a postcard. But if you take a look, well, let's zoom in a little bit. What do we got here? Passenger car. So they're running passenger service, but it gets even more fascinating. They had Farview Park. I love early names. You just know Farview. It's the top of the Moosic Mountains. Why is it called Farview? Well, because it's got this wonderful view. But it becomes a picnic ground. It's a very popular Sunday excursion place. People would go for Sunday picnics. Now remember, so that's interesting because they would actually operate the railroad on Sundays just for excursionists, even though the canal was closed. I'd never thought of that before. See, I learned something in these talks too, people. But it got more than that. So I love this story. Professor Randolph Perry of Rochester, presumably New York. Well, there's 2 of them. I'm very close to the other Rochester, New York. He was a natural philosopher, and he did a balloon ascent, but it was more than that. He parachuted down afterwards. Now, in fact, if I remember correctly, this didn't happen because of weather, but they did do it from Carbondale instead. But this becomes an amusement park. That I should have mentioned at that very first slide of the Gravity Railroad was what they called Shepherd's Crook. Well, it's almost like a roller coaster ride because you could go, whoa, around the bend. See your friends on the other side. And on the right there, I found this on an online auction. It's a tin type, very inexpensive type of photograph. On the back, it says Farview, and I think it's 1891. So these well-dressed women were there and had their picture taken. just a wonderful artifact. But you know, so now they're starting to develop the amusement park industry just as a sideline. You know, they're letting other industries use their canal and move their products on it, and they're very solicitous. They make sure that they can take care of them as well. But I'll get to, I'm a little ahead of the story. They're building up rail lines and all this time, extending their market. They have the rail line that goes right through Lake George, and these are two different books, I believe, put out by the Canal Company. The one on the right clearly, and the one on the left doesn't say it explicitly. Where I did there? Well, I went all the way to the end. Wow. Give me a second here, folks. Let me just get back where we were. That's interesting. I don't know how I did this. Oh, I kept this out. Yeah, there it is. My computer thinks it knows. Boy, if my computer was smart. Okay, you're going to get a quick look at what we're doing here. Okay, we're going to go out on the Hudson. I'm going too far now. Where were we? We were at, okay. There we go. We're there. Sorry about that. Boy, don't touch the wrong button, whatever you do, folks. You know, these books were just getting passengers to use, they had the rail line by 1872, and this is a later slide, they controlled rail lines all the way from New York City to Montreal. Makes sense. They're getting their coal up into Canada where they could really use it. And when you need coal in the winter, the canal typically opened in April and closed in December. And when did you need the most coal? In the months they weren't open. But you know, this just shows you how much they would develop other legs. You know, they were a bank for 20 years. They're embracing the telegraph. They're becoming an amusement park industry. Here is their railway station, Lake George. It still exists. In 1932, they were still operating 3 steamboats. If you know Lake George, New York, beautiful area. I've spent a lot of time there. And there's these, to this day, you can ride steamboats along. The D&H operated those in the early 20th century. And as I say, in 1932, they still owned 3 of those steamboats. What's that got to do with coal? But there you go. Or canals. At this point, they're no longer a canal company. But and here's another wonderful, some people don't think that they had packet boats because we don't have photographs, but that's because, in fact, the D&H Canal was the way that immigrants would go into northwestern Pennsylvania. It was the cheapest way to get there. We don't have, I've never seen a photograph of a packet boat on the D&H Canal. I can just tell you definitively they had them from the historical record. This is E.L. Henry painting a packet boat. It's funny because this particular painting is in a PBS thing about the Erie. People think this is the Erie. I guarantee you this was Ellenville, New York, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that the woman that wrote the book on this guy says explicitly. But, you know, E.L. was selling these as hand-colored engravings. We have 3 of them in our collection. He didn't, you know, if you thought it was the Erie, that's fine. And that just means more people would buy it. But they did an awful lot of other things. So here you can see some of one of the first products moved on the canal was wood. You know, I said, oh, they needed the coal. But here again, here's a lot of lumber, probably just offloaded off that boat or being loaded on it one way or the other. We can just tell, of course, because it's a light boat, because it's high in the water. If it were fully loaded, it would be down here, the water line, right? Get that out of the way. Rosendale cement. Natural cement was discovered in High Falls, I think. I'm still trying to nail this down. Some people say James McEntee, but I'm convinced it wasn't him. But while they were digging the canal, when they were digging the Erie Canal, a guy by the name of Canvas White discovered dolomitic limestone near Chenango, figured out how to turn it into natural cement, or into a hydraulic cement. People knew how to do it in Roman times, but then it kind of got lost. But they started figuring this out in England at the same time. And he starts making hydraulic cement, called hydraulic cement because it dries underwater, and it's super tough stuff, much better than the Portland that supplants it. The D&H Canal Company had a geologist on with their crews, I think because they knew the story. They were going to get their cement from the Erie Canal. They knew that they had discovered this cement rock digging the Erie. Hey, maybe lightning will strike again, and indeed it does. But this becomes a huge industry. There's a poor historian who's written 2 books. He claims that the D&H Canal existed because of the cement. No, the cement existed because of the canal. But in fact, the D&H Canal operated until 1916, at least, from 1902 to at least 1916, it was largely for cement. And so that's probably why this historian got the idea that that was it. But by the second half of the 19th century, over half of North America's cement is this Rosendale cement. And most of it is mined in this district. The Rosendale Cement District runs from here in High Falls all the way up to the Roundout. And those of us that live nearby, you will see kilns all along this route. And they're all cement kilns. Huge industry. You know, Statue of Liberty, Croton Aqueduct and Dam, base of the used in the Capitol, just used on the New York State Thruway. Was one of the was reopened to use on. They mixed Portland with hydraulic cement. Barrels, Coopers are barrel makers, and barrels were the way you moved a lot of things. Barrels were really important. That's another fascinating topic. Interesting side note, since we talked about Squire Whipple bridges and Pony Truss bridges, here you've got both in one picture. This is Lawrenceville Cement, named for Watson Lawrence, who developed a continuous draw cement kiln in the 1830s. Because the Rosendale cement industry gets developed, because the canal discovered it, and because they have cheap transportation to get that product to market, he develops this kiln. Virtually the rest of the 19th century, everybody uses this Watson designed kiln. Lawrenceville, now it's pretty well ruined. There's a lock and there's a minor remains of some kilns. The rest of it all gone, but a huge industry. Note the young gentleman. You know, you work young. In my marginalized talk, you'll see a lot of pictures in a lot of industries. They love the mining cement because they could get into crevices to place charges and things where grown men couldn't. And so, you know, you grew up young there. Bluestone, a naturally occurring sandstone, prevalent from northwestern Pennsylvania up into Vermont. It also comes in green and red varieties, but the bluestone was the most sought after because it was really great for sidewalks. It has the wonderful characteristic of not being slippery when wet. And you can see if you look around New York City streets, we're lined with bluestone. Beacon, New York, a friend of mine has a house in Commerce Street. There is bluestone sidewalks. They're in sorry shape. Somebody should get some money together and lift them. They could all be restored. But huge industry. You know, basically the D&H Canal allowed extractive industries a way to move these heavy goods. And in fact, it's no accident that cement was moved. It was the canal was efficacious for heavy things before the railroads ever were. Becomes a huge industry. This is actually, I love this, the derrick and the Hudson River sloop right here. These are the yards very close to this building. Fitch's, the biggest bluestone dealer in America, the second half of the 19th century. It's on a bulkhead right here, still extant. It's now a private home. It's probably right over here in this picture. This is a very early, an 1860s Portland cement plant over here. I'm not sure, probably that whole thing right there. All that's left of it is that today. There's an ice house. That's the railroad trestle in Wilbur, New York, still extant. Ice houses, another fascinating on the Hudson River, along the river, very often built on landfill, big, huge buildings, big winter employment for canalers and farmers, making barrel hoops, because metal barrel hoops don't develop until the end of the 19th century, and working on ice, you know, harvesting ice. Big industry. Ice harvesting endures until the 1930s. People don't realize, we get short memories, you know. Why museums are important too, by the way. The area where I live here, this is Rochester, New York, Accord, St. Joseph, part of that. The Shoengung conglomerate, John Roebling used it for the load-bearing stone on all of his aqueducts, and it made some of the best millstones, rivaled the French millstones, these so-called soapist stones. And in this area, when I drive through here, you can just see front yards just full of tailings, you know, all grown up, but just tons and tons of rock. Big, big, huge industry. Well, they have the canal right there. Here in Allingerville, New York, and near Rochester, New York, they're building boats. There were like at least 50. I haven't counted yet. As I go through primary sources, I'm harvesting, if you will, the names of the boat builders. Huge industry. The boats only lasted 4, 5, 10 years at most. They were built of white oak. Same problem with the locks. They had to renew the lining every 10 years or so because it was cheaper to build composite locks. Now here in High Falls, during the final enlargement, the locks on my 5 locks walk are dry stone Shogun conglomerate. They built to last. They realized what it cost. And in 1850, they realized it was worth building the more expensive dry stone masonry locks. But boat building, all along, we've got access to these wonderful maps that the D&H Canal Company, they surveyed in 1854, and they're huge. I've got the reservoir book. I've got one of the reservoir books in my collections. All the rest are up in Canada because the Canadian Pacific bought out the D&H in '90 and got all the records. But I have digital copies of all these wonderful maps. The original maps were 2 foot by 3 foot. Details of every industry, all the people, along the entire route. I'll be studying these maps the rest of my life. They're a great resource for my Where Is Our Historian. So I'll get to a spot and you'll see, oh, there was a dry dock and there was a lumber mill. No accident. There were a grocery at every lock. There were so many people, 3,000 people coming through. There was more than enough industry. Just fascinating. But again, I clearly get kind of taken with the whole story, or stories, as I like to say. So here is just one of the many boat builders. I just love this photographic opportunity. All the men standing on top of that 91-foot long boat. Proud of their work. Here's a dry dock in Ellenville, New York. Dry docks were, interesting story. The D&H was forced to have a dry dock in Honesdale. So they're selling these boats to independent contractors, usually between 10 and 20, depending on the boat, each trip. They take out of their pay. And so it would take you 4 or 5 years. So interesting too, the boats had numbers when you were buying it. Once you owned it, you got rid of the number and you named it. So if you see a named boat, it's a sign that that guy had paid it off, or I say guy, but women also did own boats. I know in some instances worked on them as well. But you got to name your boat. But so here you are, you're selling to these independent contractors. Some were good, some were bad. If you didn't take care of your boat, when do you think you'd find out? When you dumped 130 tons of coal into it. The canal company was forced to build a dry dock in Honesdale to have a spot to pull those boats out of the way so that it wouldn't stop everything at the beginning, if you know what I mean. They didn't want to go into the dry dock business, but they had to, simply to keep their canal operating. But there were numerous dry docks, very often with lumber yards near them. Makes sense. You have the lumber right there. Different industries prospered because of the canal. This one's the most fascinating. The Ellenville Glass Works, the center of town, had its own loading quay. I think they made mainly whiskey bottles, I think somebody told me. While we were researching for our new museum, my design team, I speculated in one of our Zoom meetings. I said, gee, I don't think there's a whole lot of sand near there. You always think glassworks. So they did a quick Google search and discovered that the Ellenville Glassworks, they were bringing in sand from New Jersey, up the Hudson, on the Atlantic Ocean, up the Hudson River, all the way into Ellenville, about halfway, a third of the way certainly, about a third of the way down the canal, building their product, making glass and then sending it back out. But again, it was the transportation and probably the access to the workers, I would suppose. There's a salt glazed pottery maker, his name will come to me, who was in Ellenville and then moved to moved to Honesdale. And I think the only reason he was able to do that was because he had the canal to move his product. You think South America, the Pampas, all those cowboys down there, raw hides were shipped in from South America and the Caribbean. I don't think they had the right kinds of trees to get the tannic acid to tan, because I think if they did, they would have tanned them there. But instead, raw hides, as you see here on the left, were brought up in on the, shipped up the Atlantic, up the Hudson River, out onto the canal. Some of them made it to Tannersville in the Hudson River. Some of them didn't get on the canal. But there were numerous tanneries along the D&H Canal, and then they would ship out. And over here, we've got the final product before it's been packed and shipped. Just another one of the industries. But at the same time, as I said, the D&H now is diversifying. They're building railroads. Here's the New York O&W, 1872. They built their rail line south of here. I don't have it memorized exactly where it ran, but in 1902, Samuel Kirkendall sells part of the D&H bed to the O&W, who extends their line from Ellenville up to Kingston, New York, largely on it. So part of when I'm on those sections of the canal, I have to parse what was Canal Era activity and then what did the O&W do. But I love this picture because it's a little bit of foreshadowing about what's going to be happening, which is to say, railroads are the coming thing. You know, they're almost busier as a railroad. And that's, I'd be curious to see tonnage, and that's something I'll have to research in this period and later, how much product is still going on the canal and how much is just being moved on the railroad. The PA Coal Company loses that court case and they just stop using the canal because the Erie Railroad came past their infrastructure and they just used the railroad. The railroads had developed, railroads early on couldn't carry the kind of weight that canals could. So they captured the passenger traffic. So I don't have pictures of packet boats, even though I know they were prevalent. And then on the other end of that, railroads weren't able to carry weight as quickly, but by this period they could, obviously. So that's why the canal's life was as long as they were. Remember, the D&H starts the steam locomotive era running the very first steam locomotive before they open their canal fully. And yet they operate until 1898. They operate their canal to move their coal. But, you know, the die is cast. And here, another quote, in 1895, once again, getting the cheapest labor you can. Voting is very poor on the canal, and many little girls are seen driving their teams, their service being much more cheaply obtained than that of men or boys. Famous E.L. Henry painting on the towpath. The Canal Society was offered the original of this before my time, back in the 90s, by one of the houses down in New York, one of the people that's on NC Roadshow, $350,000 for this oil painting. I would love to get it. I don't know where it wound up. I've got to look into that. It would be nice to do a show of D&H paintings in the new museum sometime. I'll have to chase these down. So many things made the news here. The last loaded boat made it in the newspaper. But it's funny, the first boat and last boat, it depends. You know, do you mean the first boat that ever navigated when the whole canal was open, or the first boat that made coal, or the first boat that was on it? Last boat too, because the last boat on the D&H Canal was in 1916 or 1917. But this would be the last boat in 1898, when the canal companies finally said, okay, it's losing money. There was speculation. At one point, they were going to actually make the canal company drain the canal and build a railroad on it. And I'm just seeing news reports. I haven't done enough research to figure out what the original impetus was. It never happened. And there's speculation in the newspapers of the day in the 1890s. Oh, the canal company's going to close. Again, I haven't crunched the numbers, but knowing what I do about the canal company, they were making money on it until they weren't. You know, maybe 98 was a slim year, but they, you know, they were hard-nosed capitalists. The D&H Canal to me is the story of America writ small to some degree. Dear Ed, in days of yore, this towpath was trod by many a man and beast. D&H Canal, 1896, at the Sherwood Lock, which is just south of Ellenville. I love the inscriptions on these. I love what they make. But, you know, here they're still celebrating the canal, but its days are numbered. And here now we've got, this is going to be in the 1900s. Trying to think, this stretch, it's after 1902. And there's a canal boat. They would have never left a boat in that. You couldn't have never left a boat swamped like that. And a lot of just looks like just wood that got thrown on it. But it's a postcard, you know. And just one more, you can see we're gearing up to the end of this story now. So 1898, the canal company sells for $10,000 to Samuel Kirkendall, who is Thomas Cornell's son-in-law and heir. He starts buying up cement companies, and he operates it from Wirtsboro to Rondout for a couple years, and then he sells to the O&W. But from east of High Falls here to the Hudson River till at least 1916, moving their product, their coal. But the canal company just takes canal out of their name, and they become the D&H Railroad. Largely successful, still moving coal throughout the 20th century. I'm going to guess it's probably, what, say the 1950s, 1960s, before heating oil really takes over from coal. The older amongst us might remember houses heated with coal rather than with oil. They eventually morph into a full freight line, and then in 1990 they go belly up and get bought out, lock, stock, and barrel, by Canadian Pacific. And they still operate the name, you know, the line in the name. And they have a lot of records. At some point, I've got to get up there to see what they have besides these wonderful maps that I'm fortunate to have copies of. But there I am, you know, hour and 18. I like my numbers, you know. I ran a little long, just like I said. But I'm happy to take questions or to you know, elaborate on anything that
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Yes, if anyone has any questions, please unmute and raise your hand and we'll take turns and hopefully we can get to all the questions. And just make sure you're unmuted. We'll let you know if we can't hear you, if you have a
I'm gonna
question.
stop. There we go. That way
Hi.
I can see y'all.
Okay, I just want to say that was fabulous. That was
Yeah, it really
fantastic.
was.
We have property in Barryville, New York, actually. And
Yep,
they're
no,
very around the canal all the time. We kayaked to Delaware a lot, and it was just a fabulous, fabulous talk. We learned a lot there. Thank you, Bill. That was
Oh, well,
fabulous.
you're very welcome, and thank you. Yeah, Berryville, I have a house in Ulen right now, although I just sold it because, yeah, so I know Ulen. I inherited 2/3 of a house in Ulen. In fact, I'll be going there next week or 2 weeks to shoot more, whereas our historian, unfortunately, Berryville, most of it's gone. You know, there was the aqueduct there.
Yeah.
It's funny, though, maybe this is a little rude joke, but I did my last presentation from the Stick It In, which is
Sure.
right there in Berryville.
It's just down the road from us.
But it gets better. It's right next to Old Lock 69.
We figured that. Yeah.
Oh.
We can see Stick It In from our property, actually, where we are. We're on the Mail Road there. And we also, when we bought the property, we have a gigantic 5-foot saw blade that we figured must have come from one of the sawmills down there and stuff.
Sure, I could probably figure out where the sawmills were from these maps.
Yeah, right. And,
What is great in that stretch is if you get over to the Mongop area,
Yeah.
there's a parking area there, and a lot of it's gone. But if you know how to get there, there's a great lock in Waysweir that's up on my Facebook page already. We also have an interactive map that we've linked to. It's a Google map that shows you all of the publicly accessible parts of the D&H and where you can park and what's there. And there's pictures of it in the historic era. There's also pictures of like video of me talking about what was there at the time. And I'm adding to it constantly as we go along as I discover new pictures that I know where they came. So it's a living document, but it's also a great resource for people that might want to go out there and chase it down on their own, because we show you. I'm also the president of the Delaware and Hudson Transportation Heritage Council, which is trying to get everybody. This is an important American story. You know, this company made America. You know, the Erie was very important too, but this company had a huge effect on the country. So it's not just a regional story. You've got to remember how small America was at that time.
Yeah.
And my mission and our mission, both the DHTHC and the D&H Canal Historical Society, is to make this story known to more people, to more
You're doing a
Americans.
great job.
Really?
We go over the Roebling Aqueduct up there at Lackawaxen numerous times a week, actually, because we're always up there. We have a camp up there. So.
It's a thrill. I always go
It is.
wee as I drive through it because it's really one-way traffic. You got to be careful. But I'll be shooting some video there with Paul King, who's a City College professor writing Roebling Before the Bridge. Fascinating. I've learned more about Roebling. I'm studying and talking with him. And he and I'm going to go and another historical filmmaker by the name of Stephen Blauweiss. He's going to go because he's got a drone. So we're going to be going now that the leaves are down. We'll be out shooting video that'll eventually get up onto both the map and D&H TV.
Terrific. Super. Really super.
Great, great.
Largely a seasonal workforce. You know, what did they do in the winter? I mean, were there still things that they could be doing in the winter months?
Well, during the enlargement, yes. So all the enlargement work was done in the winter. Sometimes repair work was done in the winter. Famously, during one of the either coal strikes or railroads, I think it was a coal strike, they had boats that had sunk and broken up, and they were actually pulling coal out of the bed. So that would have been a winter activity. But otherwise, I mean, so it's an interesting thing. Some people just made subsistence. You know, in the latter period, it was really just largely families. But one of the things I noticed in the historic record, the canal company had the right 3 tons. If you were on your way back from Roundout to Honesdale, they could put 3 tons of their material on, make you move it for them for free, you know. But that still left you 127 tons. So some boat captains would take advantage and some wouldn't. And the interesting thing is that the guys that went home with money in their pocket, maybe $200 or $300, decent pay, you know, when 50 cents to $1 a day is good pay, were the ones that took advantage of that. And the ones that just sort of, you know, phoned it in, basically, you know, could have, you know, had a harder time of it. Certainly, as I say, in the winter, barrel hoops, it sounds crazy, but millions of barrel hoops were made out of either white oak or red birch saplings, but literally millions of them. I mean, barrels were a huge thing. I mean, the coopering's so fascinating. I'm a woodworker by trade, luthier more specifically, but a woodworker. I make furniture. I build, and I love hand tools. So I've done presentations. I've got an extensive collection of hand tools. I've curated the tool room at Ulster County Historical, where I'm vice president. But coopering to me is just fascinating. But you know, barrels were what you moved so many things in, and so there was a huge need. So Whiteport, New York, which was built north of Rosendale here by Canvas White and his brother Hugh. Canvas dies very early on, so it becomes Hugh's thing. By the way, Canvas White patents how to make hydraulic cement, but everybody just violates it. The state of New York gives that man $10,000, a huge sum of money. That's how important it was. So they opened up Whiteport. Whiteport, they operated until I think it's 1850, and then I'll get the name. I think it was New York Lime and Cement buys them out. One of the big boys buys them out. In their heyday, it's a town of 1,500 people. They're shipping 1,000. They're making 1,000 barrels of cement and 800 barrels a day. Eventually, they don't have a coopering shop anymore. They have a recoopering shop. I think it's like Charlie Chips. Now I'm showing my age, right? Where you would just return the barrels and they fix them. But that gives you a sense of the size of that industry, you know. It just really, so barrel making, and then ice making, ice cutters. That was winter employment as well. Hey, Nick.
Hi. In your answer there, you mentioned some strikes that had occurred, and then also about the pay rate. In your research, have you uncovered kind of accounts of maybe not so much of the higher up workers, but kind of like your everyday worker, what their experience was with the conditions on the canal, with work conditions, with how they felt management treated them, things like that, or maybe in relation to the strikes?
Well, you know, certainly they struck, and most of the time they weren't successful. So for what it's worth, you know, again, it's hard to get those stories, so I'm only about 2/3 through PA Cole, my first reading. And by the way, anybody interested, the Hathi Trust, you can read it for free online. They have it either in the facsimile or an OCR version, which is great for me because when I want for a presentation, I can use their picture instead of opening up I own a set of these books. They're very rare, but I can just use their scan of the page. But if I want to use it in writing, I've got their OCR, and I just minor correction, I can go in. So those stories are in there, so there's stories about the guys, you do get a sense of them. It was rough and tumble, so there's an Irishman that, there's one guy who, he's working on, he's running teams of animals at one point. He's on a ship that goes to New Orleans at one point. He's running boats on the D&H, all in 1 year, Another guy, Irish immigrant, is renting out sleeping quarters for other workers during the enlargement on a boat, which leads me to believe that he was living on a boat all season long, which had to get a little chilly in the winter, these were the poorest in society. It was Black people, it was Irishmen, it was German immigrants, and again, I've done a lot of. I got a small grant from the community foundations to direct my research that way, and that's resulted in an article that will hopefully be in the Hudson River Valley Review next spring. I'm about 80% done with it, and I did actually publish a shorter version of it for the Erie Canal Museum, and it'll be in the pilot log of the Hudson River Maritime Museum on immigrants in the D&H. And if any of you are interested, shoot me an email and I'll send you a copy of it. It'll be linked on my website eventually. We're trying to get our collections up online, but I'm happy to share it with you. historian@canalmuseum.org. They had a tough life, but they worked hard, and some of them worked harder than others, certainly. But yeah, I'm trying to collect those stories and sort of get more. But it's the rich white men that wrote the histories, isn't it?
Well, thank you. Just to add to the pile of people, I also used to live in Berryville, And I'm pretty sure the canal was right in my backyard, up along, I guess it's Route 97. I think they built over it there.
Yeah, pretty much. There's not much left in that stretch. Well, the other thing is that the national landmark designation for the D&H is being rewritten in the next couple of years. They only put $50,000 towards it, which is going to make it tough to do. But I'm actually a line item on the winning bidder. I would have been working closely with them anyways, and the timing couldn't be better because I was working on this interactive map, and I'm out working on Where is Our Historian. I've walked or visited 90% of the canal, and I'm filling in whatever sections I can. Very tough under COVID to trespass, by the way. You feel a little, but
Hey, do you can you just mention your resources again, or will they be published as a part of this? Just like where to go for your information, like the YouTube piece, for instance.
canalmuseum.org. It's all there.
Okay.
The links will get a little better if you know the latest Squarespace stuff. The one YouTube link is just a little YouTube icon on the upper right, and I had to have a youngster point that out to me when I couldn't find it. Oh yeah, those things. Canalmuseum.org. There's a link to that map, and there's a link to D&H TV, so you can find it all there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have one more question. Were there many accidents on the canal? Because it seems that the canal boats are moving slowly, but you are talking a lot of material and heavy weights. So, and even with the lock functions, did you come across
stories
anything?
of ice skaters getting crushed, climbing up on lock gates when they shouldn't. There's many drownings. I've run into a lot of stories of both children running away to join the canal, must have been like the circus, and then children being kidnapped to work on the canal.
Wow.
But we get drownings. There was mine accidents. There was some severe mine accidents. I don't have the dates memorized and stuff. There was some dangerous. There were murders. Not a whole lot, but it was rough. The drownings are one of this was 4 foot deep to start with, but people didn't know how to swim. You panic, you can drown in as much water that you end up in if you were calm enough. So yes, injuries, and they didn't keep track of this so much. It's not like in their annual reports they gave you a lot of data, but never did they have injuries and deaths. Only once they did mention the severe coal accident. They paid money. I missed out. I missed out on an auction item that had to do with a fund for the coal workers. I was heartbroken. I would have loved to have gotten that for our collections. But mining is dangerous stuff. And black powder, dangerous stuff. Your blaster, you got paid a lot more money than somebody else. And there's a great story that made Baltimore. What's the name of it now? There's a story of a blaster by the name of Patton, who here in High Falls somewhere, here in the Marbletown stretch of the D&H Canal. I'm trying to remember the name of the newspaper. It was the biggest newspaper of its day, Niles Register. And it was world news. All these newspapers in that period would get stuff from other newspapers and stuff. Niles Registers talks about this tremendous blast. There was a rock in the middle of where they needed the canal bed to be. And it was some 20 foot by 30 foot, and I forget how many tons they estimated. And a blaster by the name of Patton, the contractor says, I'll give you $100 to get that blasted out of the way. And people come around to watch him blast it. He puts in, I think they said 75 pounds of powder. I have to go back and reread it. People are watching. They blast it, and it lands right where they want it in the towpath. The contractor gives them $100 bonus. He was getting $5 for it. He gives them $100 bonus. Now that's a year to 2 years' wages for a common. One piece of it lands right by one of the, it sticks into the ground by one of the people watching, because everybody came to watch the big blast, right? Pieces of it miles away in the town of Rochester. When I do tours of the 5 Locks Walk, it took me years to realize, all those broken stones over there, that's from the blasting. We actually have the blast holes on my virtual museum segments. I went out onto the 5 Block Walk because we didn't have a lot in this museum about construction. And out on the 5 Block Walk, we've got some stone where you can see the drill holes. And it's a great spot to tell this, that when I do tours now, I read from Niles Register about Patton and the blast. But people also got killed in those blasts. What I like to say, so here you're using black powder, basically gunpowder. You cap it with clay. You make your own fuse out of a saltpeter soaked paper. You had a fire somewhere away from your black powder stores, please. Matches had just been invented. They weren't common. And you'd go and you take a coal and you'd go and you'd light that and you'd all run, because to drill the hole, you use a thing called a start drill. And there'd be one guy to hold the drill and at least one guy with a sledgehammer, maybe two. And, hit, turn a quarter turn, hit, turn a quarter turn, hit, turn a quarter. And then they drill 1.5 inches down 4 foot. And I can say definitively, because that's where they are, loaded with black powder. So you go and you run and you light and you go and you hide somewhere. And now 3 things are going to happen, right? If you're lucky, it's going to go blast, you're on to the next hole. If you use too much saltpeter, if you didn't make the fuse long enough, it might blast prematurely. Dangerous job. Many men lost their lives. Again, nobody kept track. But I always thought the third thing was probably sort of the scariest. Because nothing happens. And I can just imagine 2 guys like, no, you go. No, you go. Presumably they went and had lunch, right? Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
How long did the trip take on the canal from, say, Port Jervis up to Kingston?
Well, in Port Jervis, I'd have to guesstimate. The entire trip was basically 5 days.
Oh.
So a round trip was 10 days. If you didn't get stuck somewhere, if you didn't take the trip down to New York City, which, as I say, the canal company wanted them all to do that, but the dollar and cents of it made that untenable.
Sure.
One of the few, but it's interesting that this company just dusts itself off and then it goes. So from Port Jervis, it's 4 days from there, probably 2 to 3 days from Port Jervis to round out. And it depended. Some guys would go all night. Some would work their animals. They started enforcing shutdowns for the animals' sake. I'm struck by, in the historic record, that they watched out for the mules. They had missionaries. I only know because I've ran across, there's a great book called The Raging Canal that collects a bunch of Dorothy Sanderson's research in canal-related newspaper accounts. And one of them was the obituary of a missionary. And this is after all the Workses are dead. They were still honoring, they were still, they had missionaries working. As you might have seen in some of those quotes, the canalers themselves were a rough and profane lot. And so, a little, try and make better people out of them,
One more question, quick. That house you showed in Pondetti, New York, one of your last slides there.
Yeah.
Is that still there?
I haven't chased that one down, and I was in that neck of the woods in the spring, but I didn't think to do that. I'll have to do that in a couple of weeks.
It reminds me of a house you see along 97 there, where they have the Indian Head rafting company now and stuff.
Yeah.
Be right around there, because I know Pondetti was really built up back then too. So.
Well, in Pondetti, they had, are you familiar with the mini sink battleground?
Of course.
Well, there's a bluestone. There's not many places to hike down there. Not like here in Ulster. I can hike all over the place. When I'm down there, I'm hard pressed. But there's a bluestone quarry there, and Pondetti had a lot of bluestone, and it's my contention that bluestone was exploited solely because the D&H ran through there, so they had the means to move that product. But I haven't looked for that exact house yet. So many things to do. I hope to live many. I'm 63, but I hope to live a long. Got a lot to get done yet.
Yeah, great stuff.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Another question, Eileen?
Not so much a question, because many of the questions were already asked by all the others who are participating, but I just wanted to say what a fascinating history, something I knew nearly about. And so this was really terrific for you to present this, and kudos to the library for also hosting. So thanks so much. And I'm sure at some point I'll continue to peek at your website, if not peek more. And that way, get to learn a little bit more, and also maybe come up and take a tour sometime. That'd be a lot of fun. But thank you.
We'd love to have you.
Yeah.
I love my
Thank you for
job.
participating.
You could tell you're very enthusiastic.
I've always done things
That
I
shines
love.
through. Yeah.
I'm not rich. Well, it depends on how you define rich. I'm not financially. I'm healthy. We Americans live better than 90% of this world, and I don't think we are appreciative enough. But I've always done things I love instead, and I'm very fortunate late in life to get this career that's going to take the rest of my days. I've got more than enough stuff to do. So And I really enjoyed, having the opportunity. They pay me to do, in this case, both the library, but my main job is to get this story wider known. The Canal Society's mission is to get this story wider known. So, and by the way, too, there's on November 7th, if you like wine, Kevin Raley is doing a Zoom wine tasting. Kevin Raley was the Windows on the World sommelier, who coincidentally got his start at the Canal House restaurant, at John Novy's Depew Canal House restaurant, which is now the building we own. We bought from, not really from John, his bank, but that's another story. But Kevin is probably the best known. He went on to be the Windows on the World's sommelier, and he's probably the best known sommelier in America, or one of them. He's on the board of the CIA. He's done 2 wine tastings for us as fundraisers. On November 7th, he's doing a Zoom wine tasting. It's $150, and $100 of that's going to the wine. So you get 4 bottles of really good, 2 reds and 2 whites. And so you could join up with friends or family, socially distant. The cutoff date to sign up is tomorrow, so that we can get the wine to you. And you can sign up right online. There's a wine tasting page under events on our website. If you like wine, it's for a good cause, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Kevin, like myself, I think, knows to be entertaining as well as knowledgeable. I think that as a historian, I come from a performing arts background, and it strikes me that if you're going to lose you can know your facts cold, but if you're dry, if you're boring, you've got to keep people interested. And I'm just the way God made me, and it's like I'm selling you something all the time, right? Merchant, but it serves me well when I do presentations, because it keeps people engaged, So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for attending. And this will live on. Eventually, I'll get a link to this. We'll hang this on D&H TV. And Luann, I don't know what your organizations, whether they'll have a spot for people to see it, but.
Yes, we can definitely direct people to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know. You know what? I do know. I'll have to check the metrics, but we're in it for the long haul. When we started doing D&H TV, we specifically designed it to be a sustainable effort. COVID hit, and we said, hey, this is an opportunity. We've always said we need to do more online. Now we have no excuse. And we kind of came out of the gate running. I've had the county, I've had a lot of local organizations contact us because we were doing it so early. And in fact, the History Alliance of Kingston, that's another thing that should be linked to my page soon. 14, and it's growing, cultural organizations, mainly history organizations in this area, have banded together. We've created a scavenger hunt, and now we've got a cemetery hunt that's active right now. There's these online history hunts, but we're now talking about doing some research together. I think it's going to be a perfect platform to get further information about marginalized populations, where all of us can go out to the people, because a lot of these stories are with folks like you. They're not in books because they weren't known to the rich white men that still rule the world, let's face it. And so it's very exciting. We're doing these hunts together. It's a way for these smaller organizations to have an online presence, but it's growing into an organization that's doing research together. It's really powerful and gratifying, and an awful lot of fun. And so it's an organization to watch, the History Alliance of Kingston, or HAC as we call ourselves, and the Hudson Valley History Hunt. So
great, wonderful, treasure trove.
Plugged everything I was supposed to plug.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Again, thank you so much, Putnam History Museum, and Cassie Ward, the director, and Nick, I'm sorry, Capicato. Is that close? Really appreciate being able to co-host this and your involvement with promoting it. And again, Bill Merchant, terrific talk. And I hope we can do this again at some point in the future, and maybe just pick another aspect of it and continue learning about the region.
I have 2 other PowerPoints up, and I'll continue adding to them once I'm moving the museum right now. I'm done with the collections, but we're still got a lot of work there. But we'll be adding to, and I want to start doing these on my own platform. There's so much technology to learn and to deal with. And if I do, I'll have to start doing, well, I think postcards of the D&H, I'm already ready. I got the, just do a whole talk with just postcard images. of the D&H and tell the stories they tell. You know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think all of us will be looking at these different websites and continue learning. Thank
I
you
learn
so
something new
much.
every day. That's what I like to
Yeah.
say. That's why I get up in the
Yeah.
morning. So
Exactly.
a pleasure to see all you fine folk.
Exactly. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.